The first thing they told me when I arrived on Velshin was that the Queen did not meet humans. Garrison Commander Yale Das delivered this information the way she delivered most information, clipped, flat, and without eye contact, her attention fixed on a data tablet she was reviewing as I stepped off the transport ramp onto soil that smelled of copper and wet stone. She had the look of someone who had once cared enormously about a great many things and had slowly, deliberately stopped. I'd known people like that in the war. I'd been people like that. "You will be assigned to Terrace 7, she said. "Agronomist posting. Your clearance is level 1. You will not approach the spire. You will not speak to any Velshanin above the rank of tender unless spoken to first. You will not, under any circumstances, attempt to make contact with the sovereign." She finally looked up. Her eyes were the color of flint. "Understood, Dr. Vasari." "Understood," I said. "My name is Elena Vasari. I was 34 years old when I came to Velshin, a xenobotanist with 12 publications, a half-finished grant proposal for a terrace soil restoration program, and approximately nothing left for me on Earth. I had volunteered for the posting the way you volunteer to go somewhere very cold, not because you want the cold, but because you want to stop feeling whatever you'd been feeling before. The colony was called Eden, Earth-Derived Ecological Nexus, which was the kind of acronym that made you suspect the person who invented it had arrived at the letters first and worked backward to the words. There were 62 of us, biologists, engineers, linguists, medical staff, a single political liaison named Harv Morel, who nobody liked living and working within the walled terraces of a Velshanin agricultural district. We were the first human colony permitted on Velshan soil. We were, according to the diplomatic communiques, a gesture of good faith. The reality was more complicated than that, in the way that reality always is more complicated than diplomatic communiques. The Velshanin had agreed to host the colony after 3 years of negotiation that I only knew in summary, and the summary was that they had agreed under terms that the human diplomatic team had initially considered generous, and that the Eden colonists, once they arrived and looked around, understood, were actually extremely carefully calculated. We had been given access to a particular agricultural district, not the most productive, not the closest to any major population center, but chosen with a specificity that suggested it had been selected for exactly the kind of observation it allowed. We were visible without being proximate to anything they couldn't afford to have us see. We were close enough to demonstrate trust and far enough to limit what that trust exposed. Harv Morel had spent his first 2 weeks in a state of low-level architectural outrage about this. I had spent my first 2 weeks finding it interesting. The distinction between me and Harv Morel was, I think, that he had come to Velshan expecting to find something to negotiate, and I had come expecting to find something to study. When you come to a new place to negotiate, you look for imbalances and advantages. When you come to study, you look at what's there. What was there was extraordinary, on a level that I had not fully prepared for even after a decade of reading everything published about Velshanin agricultural science. The Velshanin had been farming this planet for approximately 9,000 years, by the dating systems I trusted, and in that time they had developed an understanding of soil chemistry, root behavior, and plant genetics that made Earth's most advanced agricultural science look like something done by people who had just discovered dirt. The terraces were not simply productive, they were self-regulating, self-repairing, and possessed of a biological intelligence I was only just beginning to have the vocabulary to describe. The remembering was not one system. It was a nested hierarchy of systems, the root networks of each crop variety interfacing with the root networks of adjacent varieties in ways that balanced nutrient loads, managed water distribution, and signaled threats, insect, fungal, climatic, across the entire terrace district in approximately the time it took me to run a single soil core sample. I had, within my first week, filled 3 personal notebooks and revised my entire understanding of what soil science was for. The Velshanen had a different phrase for what we were. "You are the experiment," my assigned tender told me on my third day, without particular malice. Her name was Sophie, and she was approximately 8 feet tall with skin the blue-gray of deep ocean water, and a secondary set of eyes that remained half-lidded at rest, opening fully only when she was focused on something she found interesting. She said this as she was teaching me the proper way to test the moisture content of Velshanen terrace soil, which required an instrument that looked like a tuning fork and worked on principles I only partially understood. "We want to see what you do. Whether you break things or fix them." "Which do you expect?" I asked. Both sets of her eyes opened briefly. "We have not decided." The terraces were extraordinary. I want to say that plainly, before I say anything else. The agricultural terraces of Velshan were among the most beautiful things I had ever seen, and I had spent my professional life in places people called beautiful. They rose in concentric rings around the spire at the colony's center, each terrace 10 meters tall and 200 wide, planted with crops that had no earth equivalent, and tended by Velshanen tenders who worked with a precision and care that felt almost liturgical. The soil itself was remarkable, layered, complex, threaded through with a root network that the Velshanen called the Remembering, which I initially assumed was a poetic name, and later came to understand was something closer to functional description. The plants remembered. That was the discovery that changed everything for me. I found it by accident, the way most things worth knowing are found. I was running soil core samples in Terrace 7 on a Thursday morning, or what passed for Thursday on a planet with a 31-hour day, when I noticed that 2 adjacent planting plots had diverged in a way that the standard nutrient distribution models couldn't explain. The plot nearest the terrace wall was thriving. The plot 2 meters away was dying. The soil chemistry was identical. The moisture levels were identical. The light exposure was within normal variance. What wasn't identical was that the thriving plot was growing next to a section of wall that bore a carved relief of the Queen. I stared at it for a long time. Then I did something I probably shouldn't have. I took a cutting from the dying plot and replanted it in a small container of soil I'd collected from the base of the wall, right under the carving. I did this quietly. I did not write it in my daily report. I set the container on the windowsill of my housing unit and watered it and watched. Within 48 hours, it was growing again. I didn't tell anyone immediately, because I didn't know what I had. What I had, as far as I could tell, was evidence that Velshanen plant life responded to proximity to representations of the Queen in a way that exceeded any mechanism I understood, which was either a finding of extraordinary scientific significance or evidence that I had made a catastrophic error in my methodology. I spent 2 weeks trying to find the error. I couldn't find the error. What I found instead, as I worked backward through the agricultural literature Sophie had given me access to, slowly, painfully reading Velshanen text through a translation matrix that rendered everything in the slightly formal, off-kilter English that felt like speech filtered through fog, was that this was known. Not widely discussed, not explained in any of the standard agronomic texts, but acknowledged in certain older writings in the way that things are acknowledged when everyone knows them, and no one wants to be the one to define them. The Velshanen believed that the Queen was the source. Not metaphorically, not in the religious sense that requires you to discount biology. They believed, and had apparently always believed, that the biological health of Velshan's agricultural systems was in some direct and measurable way connected to the physical presence and well-being of the sovereign. When she was strong, the terraces thrived. When she was ill or troubled, the remembering grew thin and the yields fell. It was the central reason the spire was built where it was, at the heart of the terraces, so that proximity would be maximized. I sat with this for a long time. Then I went back to my dying planting plot, which was continuing to decline despite standard interventions, and I looked at the Terrace 7 wall, which bore no carving, and I thought about what it meant that a scientist's experiment had uncovered something that an entire civilization had always known and simply never explained to the newcomers. I didn't tell Garrison Commander Das. I told Sophie. She was quiet for a very long time when I finished, long enough that I started to wonder if I'd made a mistake, if I'd crossed some line I hadn't seen. The secondary eyes had opened fully and hadn't closed. She was looking at me the way she looked at something she found interesting. "You are certain of your methodology," she said finally. It was not a question. "I've run the trial 14 times," I said. "Same result each time. The remembering responds to the Queen's image. Not just her image, her voice recorded and played through a speaker had a similar effect, smaller but measurable. Her written name in the formal script had a very small effect. The stronger the representation, the stronger the response." "And you believe," Sophie said carefully, "that the Queen is not aware of this?" "I think," I said, "that the Queen is probably very aware of this. I think what she may not be aware of is that a human has now independently verified it using instruments that produce quantifiable data rather than traditional observation." The secondary eyes finally closed to half-mast. "This will be reported." "I assumed it would be," I said. "I'd rather it came from you than from Garrison Commander Das. Das will frame it as a security concern." Something shifted in Sophie's expression. Not quite a smile, Velshanin facial musculature didn't map precisely to human expressions, but a relaxation of the careful neutrality she usually maintained around the colonists. "You understand our internal politics better than most," she said. "I understand," I said, "that someone who controls the agricultural data controls the narrative. I've seen that on Earth too." She looked at me for another moment. Then she reached into the satchel at her side and removed a small carved token, a stylized abstract shape that I recognized from the terrace walls, and set it on the table between us. "The Sovereign will hear of this," Sophie said. "How she responds is not something I can predict, but I would advise you to continue your work carefully, and to be patient." I picked up the token. The moment my fingers closed around it, I felt something odd, a faint warmth, a slight resonance, like a string being plucked somewhere at the edge of hearing. I looked at the potted plant on my windowsill. It had opened a new leaf overnight. I hadn't noticed. "I can be patient," I said. 3 weeks passed. I kept working. The terrace plots continued to yield data, and I continued to write reports that disclosed roughly 60% of what I was actually finding and filed everything else under a project folder I called personal notes, which was honest enough that it didn't feel like a lie. What I was finding, in the files I wasn't sharing with Garrison Commander Das, was that the Queen was in trouble. Not politically, not the kind of trouble that generates diplomatic incidents or colonial security alerts. The kind that shows in the soil. The agricultural yield data for the inner terraces, the ones closest to the spire, had been declining for the past 8 months before I arrived. Slowly, a fraction of a percent at a time, but consistently and in a pattern that matched nothing in the environmental record. No drought, no blight, no disease vector. Just a slow, steady withdrawal of something the plants needed. The Velshanin tenders knew. They had to know. But the official agronomic reports were filed with the colony administration at a lag of 3 weeks, which meant that by the time Das saw them, the data was old enough to misread. And the tenders, I had come to understand, did not volunteer information to Garrison Commander Das any more than strictly necessary. I ran the numbers 17 different ways. The answer came out the same each time. The connection was weakening. Something was wrong with the Queen. "You should not have concluded this," Sophie told me when I showed her. She said it without accusation, the way you might tell someone they had walked into a room they weren't supposed to be in. "I know," I said, "but I did." "You are going to tell me what you intend to do with it." I'd like to help, I said. If there's something I can contribute, if there's something in the data that your own analysts haven't found, some angle that a human perspective gives me, I'd like to offer it. Not to Das, to whoever needs to hear it. Sophie sat very still. Outside the window of her workroom, a pair of tenders moved between the planting rows in the slow, deliberate way that always reminded me of people practicing something sacred. "Do you understand?" she said. "What you are suggesting? You are suggesting that you have information about the physical condition of the sovereign that her own people have not been able to extract from the same data. And you are suggesting that a human, the very species we brought here as an experiment, to watch and evaluate, should be the one to deliver it. I'm suggesting that sometimes people see things from the outside that are hard to see from the inside," I said. "I'm not suggesting I'm smarter than your analysts. I'm suggesting I'm looking at the same data with no stake in what it says, which is a different kind of useful." Another long silence. Sophie had, I noticed, stopped looking directly at me and was looking instead at the plant on my windowsill. It had grown considerably in the past 3 weeks. It was now the healthiest specimen of its species in my entire research space. "I will convey your offer," she said finally. "I cannot promise anything beyond that." "I know," I said. "I'm good at patience." The summons came at 2 in the morning by my internal clock, which meant approximately 4 hours after I'd fallen asleep and was not quite ready to be articulate. It came in the form of Sophie standing outside my housing unit door, which was not how I'd expected it to arrive, and it was delivered in a tone that left no room for the kind of response that begins with, "Can I have an hour?" "The sovereign will see you now," Sophie said. "Please dress appropriately." I was not certain what appropriately meant in this context. I put on the best version of my field clothes, the cleanest set, the ones without soil in the knees, and followed Sophie out into the pre-dawn quiet of the terrace district, where the plants glowed faintly silver in the absence of Velshan's twin suns. I had never been past Terrace 3. The spire was in the center of a complex I'd only seen from satellite imagery. As we walked, the terraces grew denser, more elaborate, the plantings more ordered, and the remembering more visible. The network of root connections actually surfaced in the soil near the spire, tracing patterns in the dirt that seemed almost deliberate, almost written. I noticed that as we walked, the plants closest to our path leaned slightly in my direction. I did not say anything about this. I filed it. The sovereign of Velshan was not what I had expected, and I should probably examine why I expected anything at all, given that I had never seen her and had been explicitly told that the queen did not meet humans. She was seated or arranged, since the posture had no good English analog, on a structure that was more dais than throne, in a chamber at the heart of the spire that was open to the sky above and sealed below by a floor of something that looked like polished stone and felt, when I stepped on it, like it was breathing. She was the same blue-gray as Sophie, but darker, deeper, like water over very great depth. The secondary eyes were not half-lidded. All 4 of her eyes were fully open, and all 4 of them were on me. I stopped at the distance I guessed was appropriate and did what felt most honest. I stood still and let her look. After a moment, she spoke. The translation matrix in my earpiece rendered it about 2 seconds late, and the English came out in that formal, off-kilter register that I had come to think of as the language's texture transferred imperfectly. "You found something in the data that my tenders did not." "Your tenders found the same things I found," I said carefully. "I think I may have been willing to say certain things more directly because I had less to lose by being wrong. This is a human quality. It's a quality of people who are new to a situation. When you've been in something for a long time, you develop assumptions about what the data can mean. I haven't been here long enough to have assumptions." She was quiet. The chamber was absolutely silent except for a sound I gradually identified as the remembering, the root network of the entire terrace district converging at this point, making a sound below the threshold of hearing that I felt in my sternum. "Tell me what you found," she said. I told her, all of it. Not the 60% I'd given to Sovi, but everything, every data point, every failed intervention, every anomalous reading, every comparison I'd run between the historical yield records and the current decline curve. I told her what my models predicted if the decline continued at its current rate. I told her that I didn't know what was causing it, only that I had ruled out every environmental factor I could test for, and that what remained, by process of elimination, was something internal to the source. She listened without interrupting. The secondary eyes tracked me the way certain predators track movement, not with threat, but with total attention. When I finished, she said, "You believe I am ill." "I believe something is wrong," I said. "I don't have the expertise to say what. I'm not a physician. I'm a soil scientist who stumbled into your biology from the root end." A sound came from her then that the translation matrix didn't render, something below language, a low resonance that the floor caught and amplified. I felt it in my feet. "The physicians have found nothing," she said. "My council has found nothing. My tenders have found nothing. You are a human who has been on Velshin for 6 weeks." "Yes," I said. "Why should I believe you have found something they have not?" "You shouldn't," I said. "You should take what I found and give it to people who can do something with it. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to look at the data with the same external perspective I'm able to bring." She looked at me for a very long time. "You are not afraid of me," she said. "I'm terrified of you," I said honestly. "But I'm more afraid of watching something extraordinary die slowly, because everybody around it is too invested in it to read the numbers clearly." Another silence, longer this time. "You may sit," she said at last, "and you will explain everything you have found in detail, from the beginning." I sat down on the breathing floor of the spire and started to talk. I spent 6 hours in that chamber. She asked questions the way only a handful of people I had ever met asked questions, not to demonstrate knowledge, not to test, but because she genuinely did not know the answer and genuinely needed to. She asked about the methodology of each soil core reading I'd taken, the margin of error in my moisture instruments, whether the root network's surface expression I was observing in the inner terrace plots could be caused by something as simple as foot traffic compressing the soil in differential patterns. She was not a scientist in the formal sense, but she thought with the particular precision of someone who had spent decades making decisions that depended on understanding systems rather than people. I had worked with enough administrators and diplomats to know the difference. At some point, without quite deciding to, I stopped presenting and started thinking out loud. I said the things I'd been keeping in the 40% folder. The preliminary conclusion about the remembering's decline not matching any external cause. The anomalous readings I hadn't been able to explain, and had set aside for later because I didn't want to include them in a report until I understood them. I talked the way I used to talk with Lena, my colleague who had died in the 3rd year of the war, who had been the last person I'd found who could keep up with my thinking and push back on it at the same time. The Queen pushed back. Not combatively. She did it the way a good interlocutor does it, by asking the exact question that identified the assumption I hadn't examined. When I outlined my hypothesis about the decline originating at the remembering central node rather than propagating inward from the terrace edges, she said, "What would that pattern look like if the interference was coming from something that moved, something that was sometimes near the center and sometimes not?" I stopped. I had been modeling the interference as stationary. I had assumed a fixed source because the data fluctuated but always around the same mean. But a moving source would produce exactly the same pattern if it moved within a bounded area. Like, for instance, an area the size of the spire's administrative wing. I pulled out my tablet and started rerunning the timeline. She watched me work. She didn't speak. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the specific quality of silence that exists when two people are thinking about the same problem from different angles and both know that interrupting would cost more than waiting. After 20 minutes, I looked up. "It's worse than I thought," I said. "Tell me," she said. I know that because it was mid-morning when I walked back to Terrace 7, and Sophie was waiting for me with an expression I couldn't quite categorize, and a silence that lasted until I started to make tea before she finally said, "That was not a normal audience." "I figured," I said. "She does not ask people to sit," Sophie said. "Not human people, not in my memory." She asked me to explain my methodology in detail. I sat because I was going to be there a while. I handed Sophie a cup. "She has very good questions." "The Sovereign," Sophie said carefully, "has the best questions of anyone on Velshin." "I know that now," I said. What I didn't say, what I wasn't ready to say to anyone yet, including myself, was that 6 hours of talking to someone who asked the kind of questions that made your own thinking sharper and clearer as you answered them was the first time I had felt, since before the war, like I was entirely present in a room. Like the thing I was doing mattered to the person I was doing it for. Like the numbers and the soil and the slow, terrible decline curve were not just data, but something that, to someone, was urgent and personal and worth understanding. I had arrived on Velshin because I had nothing left. I was beginning to suspect that was not still true. The summons came again 2 days later, and again 4 days after that. And then, gradually, they stopped being summons and became something else. Arrangements, scheduled through Sophie, that Garrison Commander Das was not informed of, because the Velshinin political structure did not require the Sovereign to report her schedule to the administrative liaison of a human colony, and Das had apparently not thought to ask. What we were doing in those sessions in the Spire Chamber was science. I want to be clear about that. We were running through the data, building models, eliminating hypotheses. I would bring my findings and she would bring information about her own physiology that she had access to and her physicians didn't. The kind of first-hand knowledge a patient has about their own body that never quite makes it into the medical record. I would run the numbers. She would tell me when they matched her experience and when they didn't. It was the most productive scientific collaboration I had ever been part of. The Velshinin Sovereign's connection to the remembering was not the simple metaphysical relationship that the older texts described. It was neurological, as far as I could determine from the data. A genuine biological interface between the Sovereign's nervous system and the chemical signaling network that ran through the root systems of the entire agricultural district. The Velshinin had been managing this connection for so many generations that they had stopped thinking of it as a mechanism and started thinking of it as a fact. The way you stop thinking of your own heartbeat as a mechanism and simply accept that your heart beats. This meant that asking, "Why is the connection weakening?" was in some ways equivalent to asking, "Why is her heart beating differently?" The answer required looking at both the external system and the internal one simultaneously and finding the feedback loop between them. She was very good at describing the internal one. "There are days," she said in our 4th session, "when the remembering feels close and present. As if the soil and the root systems are a secondary set of perceptions. I know the terrace conditions without having to check the reports because I feel them, the way you feel the temperature of a room when you walk into it. And there are other days when it is far away and muffled, like hearing a conversation through a wall." "When did the muffling start?" I asked. She thought about it. "Gradually, long enough ago that I did not notice the change immediately. It came the way seasons come, so slow that each day looks like the day before." "And your council," I said carefully, "do they know about the subjective experience of the connection, the way it feels?" "My council," she said, "knows that the agricultural yields are declining. They know that I have been consulting physicians. They do not know the subjective detail. The sovereign's experience of the remembering is not shared with the council. It is considered private. I filed this. The physicians would have been working from the outside in, which was the correct approach if you assumed the problem originated externally. But if you were looking for a small, targeted interference inside a closed system, starting from the outside was the worst possible angle. I need to map your movements over the past year, I said. Your schedule, which rooms you occupy at which times, how long you spend in each section of the spire. Not the public record, the actual daily movement pattern. She was quiet for a moment. You believe the interference has a spatial component, she said. I believe the interference correlates with your proximity to something that's been in the administrative wing, I said. I can't confirm it without the movement data. The movement data, she said slowly, is maintained by the administrative management system. I know, I said. The silence that followed was the kind that both of us understood. The data I needed was held in exactly the system I suspected. I can describe it from memory, she said finally. I do not need to access the management system to tell you where I have been. Then let's start there, I said, and I opened a new file on my tablet and began to map the interior geography of the spire based on the memory of the person who lived in it. It was the most productive scientific collaboration I had ever been part of. It was also something else, though I did not identify what until later. What I identified first was that the Queen had a habit of asking me questions that were only partly about the science. She would ask about Earth, about the war, about what I had lost that had sent me to this particular posting on this particular planet at this particular time. She asked these questions with the same precision she brought to the soil chemistry, not curious in an unfocused way, but specifically curious, as if she were building a model of me the same way I was building a model of her terrace system. I answered. I told her about the war. I told her about the colleague I'd lost in the third year who had been the only person I'd known who cared as much about root systems as I did, Lena, who had grown up on a farm in the Czech Republic and had gone into xenobotany because she wanted to know if other planets' plants made the same sound grass does in the wind, which was the most specifically human reason I had ever heard for choosing a field, and also the one that made the most sense to me. I told her about the grant proposal and the empty apartment, and the 3 separate conversations with people who loved me in which they had said, in different ways, that I needed to go somewhere and come back different. Were they correct? She asked. I don't know yet, I said. I've been here 11 weeks. Do you feel different? I thought about the potted plant on my windowsill. I thought about the 60% and the 40%. I thought about the way, since the 3rd week, I had stopped waking up at 3 in the morning with my heart doing the thing it did after bad dreams and had started instead, waking up thinking about the soil core data and whether I'd tested the right hypothesis. I feel more useful, I said. That's not the same thing, but it's something. She considered this the way she considered everything, carefully, without rushing to a response. On Velshan, she said, we believe that the place that heals you is always the place you went to escape something else. No one ever travels toward healing. They travel away from pain, and the healing happens to them at the destination, which they did not choose for that purpose. I looked at her. Do you have something like that yourself, a place? I have the remembering, she said, or I did when the connection was whole. A pause. I have been told I am difficult to heal because I am the source of everyone else's healing. There is an assumption that I do not require it. That's a very old assumption, I said. We make it on Earth too. It usually ends badly. Yes, she said, with a quietness that sat differently in the room than anything she'd said before. I know. I told her about the 60% of my reports that I was giving to Das and the 40% I was keeping, and she laughed at that. a sound the translation matrix didn't quite catch, but that I felt as a warmth in the floor of the chamber. "You are protecting the data," she said. "I'm protecting the integrity of the investigation," I said. "DOS would find a way to make it political." "All things here are political," she said. "You are not naive about this." "No," I said, "but some things are worth protecting from politics for as long as you can manage it." She was quiet for a moment. "My council believes the human colony is a mistake," she said. "They believed from the beginning that you would bring disruption." "Has this not turned out to be correct?" I said. She made that sound again, the warmth below language. "Perhaps disruption is not always a mistake." I thought about what Sophie had said to me in my third week, standing in Terrace 7. "We want to see what you do, whether you break things or fix them." "Have you decided yet?" I asked. She looked at me all four eyes. "Which?" "Whether humans break things or fix them." "I think," she said, "that humans are not oriented toward either. I think humans are oriented toward understanding things. Whether that leads to breaking or fixing depends on what they find." "And what have I found so far?" I asked. The floor carried her answer upward through its breathing surface before she spoke it. "Something no one else was looking for," she said. "Which is its own kind of rare." "The breakthrough came in the 9th week." I was reviewing, for the 40-something time, the historical records of the Remembering's behavior during past sovereign reigns, when I found a pattern in the data that I had been looking at for 2 months and had somehow not seen. The decline curves. I had been treating them as a single continuous trend, but they were not. They were two overlapping trends with different origins, different starting points, different rates. One was genuine physical decline, slow and probably addressable. The other was something else. Someone was interfering with the Remembering signal. Not externally, not from outside the spire. From within the administrative layer of the terrace management system, which I had been given limited access to as part of my posting and had been working within for 9 weeks. From a set of subroutines that should, according to the system documentation, have been inactive for years. Someone on the inside was suppressing the Queen's connection to the Remembering. Slowly, incrementally, in a way that would look like natural decline if you were looking at the data from the top down, which was how everyone had been looking at it. I sat with this for 1 hour. Then I encrypted everything, created 3 separate copies on 3 separate storage drives, and went to find Sophie. I will not describe in detail what happened in the following 48 hours, because some of it is not mine to describe, and some of it I did not directly witness. What I can tell you is that the information I brought to Sophie reached the Queen within 3 hours of my finding it, and that the Queen's response was swift and entirely outside the structure of the council that had been advising her. What I can tell you is that it was not one person. It was 4 members of the agricultural management tier who had been suppressing the signal incrementally for over a year, operating on the belief that a sovereign whose connection to the Remembering weakened would become more dependent on their council and eventually more controllable. It was a very old political calculation, dressed in the language of agronomic management subroutines. I recognized the shape of it from Earth, from every human civilization that had ever found a way to make the person at the center of a system feel that they needed the people managing the system. It was not alien in any meaningful sense. It was the oldest human error translated into the language of a different biology, and maybe that was why I had recognized the pattern when I looked at it from the outside. Not because I was smarter, because I had grown up surrounded by the source material. I spent the 48 hours in my housing unit, not by choice but because Sophie came to my door on the first evening and said, in a tone that left no room for argument, "You should remain here tonight." She brought me food, actual Velshanin food, not the nutrient packages the colony administration issued, but something from the terrace kitchens that smelled of the soil it had grown in and tasted like nothing I could compare to anything I already knew. I ate it sitting on my windowsill next to the plant, watching the spire's light shift in ways I was learning to read. I was not afraid. I want to be specific about that, because fear would have been the reasonable response to having uncovered a conspiracy within the administrative structure of the civilization hosting your experimental colony. Fear, or at least the tactical intelligence to pretend to fear. But I had given the data to Sovi, and the data had reached the Queen, and the Queen was. I had spent 3 months in close proximity to her thinking, and I knew that she was not the kind of person who sat with information. She was the kind of person who moved. I trusted her to move. That was the thing I identified during those 48 hours in my housing unit, sitting with the Velshanin food, and the plant, and the slowly shifting light on the spire wall. I had arrived on this planet with nothing left to lose, and I had spent 3 months in proximity to someone who had given me something to lose again, which was the only way you can measure trust, by what you're willing to stake on it. I was staking the whole investigation, the colony's expanded status, my posting, my proposal, everything I'd found. I was very calm about it. What I can tell you is that when the interference was removed, when the subroutines were disabled, and the remembering signal was allowed to flow unimpeded for the first time in over a year, the change in the Terrace data was immediate. I was in the field when it happened. Terrace 7, mid-afternoon, running routine samples. The plants in the plot nearest the wall straightened. Not metaphorically, I mean they physically straightened a degree or two, like people who have been sitting hunched over a desk and suddenly remember how to sit properly. The soil temperature rose by a fraction of a degree. The remembering, which I could see in the surface root tracings near the spire, brightened in color. Not glowed, that's not the right word, it clarified. The way a radio signal clarifies when you get close enough to the source. I stood in the field with my sample kit in my hands and watched it happen, and felt something very large and very quiet settle in my chest. The kind of thing that settles when you have been holding tension for so long that you have forgotten you were holding it, and then it releases, and you realize how much weight it was. I put down the kit. I sat down on the terrace wall, which you were technically not supposed to do, but no tender came to correct me, and I let the afternoon suns warm the top of my head, and I breathed the copper-end whetstone air of Velshan, and I thought, the hardest part is over. The hard part of the science, at least. Everything from here would be the other kind of hard. The kind that was harder to measure, and probably more important. I received a summons that evening, not through Sovi. Directly, delivered by a tender I had never met, wearing markings I hadn't seen before, who handed me a small carved token similar to the first one Sovi had given me but different in weight and detail, and said simply, "The Sovereign requests your presence." The chamber was different at evening. The open sky above it held Velshan's smaller sun in descent, and the light it cast was the color of something I'd call amber if amber ran to violet at the edges. The remembering was visible in the floor beneath me. I could see the network through the polished stone now, lit from within. The connections between the terrace root systems and this central point made suddenly apparent. She was standing when I arrived, not seated on the dais. Standing at the center of the chamber, on the breathing floor, with all 4 eyes fully open, and something in her posture that I can only describe as relief. "It is corrected," she said. "I can see that," I said. "The data is, yes, dramatically changed. The inner terrace yields will begin recovering within the week, I think. The remembering's regenerative capacity is significant." She looked at me for a long moment. "You found this," she said. "A human soil scientist from an experiment colony who has been on Velshan for 61 days found what my council, my physicians, and my own people could not." "I found a pattern," I said. "What you did with it was the harder part. You are deflecting credit." "I am accurately distributing it," I said. She made that sound. The floor carried it up through the soles of my feet, and I thought, distantly, that I had never been in a conversation where I could feel the other person's laughter in my bones. I have been told, she said, that you filed 60% of your findings with your garrison commander and kept the remainder in a folder called Personal Notes. That is accurate, I said. Was I in the other 40%? I held her gaze, all four of them, which took some adjusting to, and said, yes. The silence that followed was different from the silences before. Not analytical, not waiting for more information. Something had shifted, some calculation had been completed, and what was left was quieter and simpler than anything we had said to each other before. Sophie tells me, the Queen said, that the plant on your windowsill is the healthiest specimen of its kind in the colony. It's been listening, I said. 6 weeks of Velshanin botanical research papers read aloud, some very bad attempts at singing, and approximately 40 conversations about soil chemistry. Apparently it finds all of that interesting. Or, she said, it finds the person saying those things interesting. I didn't have an answer for that. The floor was warm beneath me, the remembering threading its way around and through the chamber, and the plants on the terrace walls leaned infinitesimally inward. Elena Vasari, the Queen said. It was the first time she had used my first name. In Velshanin, the formal script didn't make the distinction, but spoken aloud the register was unmistakable. What will you do now? Your grant proposal, the terrace soil restoration project. You mentioned it once. You did not file it with your garrison commander. No, I said. It was in the 40%. I would like to see it, she said, if you would be willing to share it. I looked at her for a moment. The research, the thing I had carried here along with everything else, the half-finished proposal that was either the most important work I'd ever started or the evidence that I was still, on some level, trying to be the person I'd been before everything that had unmade me. I would be willing, I said. Good, she said. And then, after a moment, there is a room in the spire with better instruments than Terrace 7. I have been told you have been compensating for inadequate equipment throughout your posting. Sophie talks too much, I said. Sophie, the Queen said, with that warmth below language, has been providing me with unsolicited assessments of your work since your 3rd day. I thought about the token on my windowsill, the plant that had opened a new leaf the day after I received it, the soil temperature readings that had been slightly elevated in a radius around my housing unit without any external explanation. She knows, I said. Everyone here knows, the Queen said simply. The remembering is not subtle. I stood in the amber-violet light of the spire chamber with the root network of an entire civilization's agricultural system, lit up beneath my feet, and thought about the data I'd been collecting for 61 days, and the 40% I'd kept to myself, and the reason I'd kept it. I would like, I said, to see that room. Then you will, she said, and she turned toward the inner corridor of the spire, and I followed, and the plants along the wall straightened as we passed, and beneath us the remembering ran bright and unimpeded from the center of this world to its edges, carrying whatever it was that kept things alive. Garrison Commander Das called me into her office 3 weeks later. She looked as always like someone who had once cared about many things and had chosen not to. She had my file on her tablet, and she was looking at it without looking at me. The office was the most aggressively Earth-standard space in the entire colony, clean lines, neutral tones, a framed photograph of something institutional on the wall that I had never looked at closely enough to identify. It was the kind of space that said, I have not changed to be here. I have brought myself with me intact. I understood the impulse. I had arrived with it too. I was no longer sure I still had it. Your reports, she said. Yes, I said. They've been incomplete. They've been 60%, I said, which is technically more than half. She looked up, the flint eyes. The Sovereign has been in communication with Earth administration, she said, directly, without going through this office. Is that unusual? I asked. It is unprecedented, she said. I noticed that she did not look pleased about this, and also that she did not look entirely displeased, which was interesting. Das was many things, but she was not stupid, and she had presumably done the same arithmetic I had. If the sovereign of Velshan was willing to contact Earth administration directly on behalf of a human soil scientist who had been here 3 months, the value of that relationship exceeded whatever investigative discomfort it had generated. Das was the kind of person who managed things. She had spent her career managing the interface between human institutions and alien ones, containing variance, smoothing friction, translating the unpredictable into the administrable. I was not sure she had ever encountered a variance that improved the outcome rather than complicating it, and I was not sure she knew how to process it. "What did they say?" I asked, though I already knew because Sophie had told me, and I had already written my response to Earth Administration's offer, and the response was 2 words, and those words were yes and absolutely. "They want to expand the program," Das said, "from 62 colonists to 240. They want to upgrade Eden from experimental status to permanent partnership status." She looked at me with the expression of someone who has arrived at a conclusion they were not expecting and are not entirely sure how to process. "They have also received an official communication from the Sovereign requesting that you be named as the primary human liaison for the expansion." "I see," I said. "You are a soil scientist," Das said. "Yes," I said. "Who has been keeping 40% of your findings private." "Also yes." For the benefit of the science," I said, "and of the relationship between this colony and the people who actually decide what happens on this planet." She set the tablet down. It was the first time in our entire professional relationship that I had seen her put it down. "You found something wrong with the terrace system," she said. "Yes." "And you brought it to the Sovereign." "To Sophie first, then the Sovereign, yes. Instead of to me." I met her eyes. "If I had brought it to you, it would have become a security matter, a diplomatic incident, a formal inquiry into the agricultural management tier, which would have required the Velshanin Council's participation, which would have alerted exactly the people I needed to not alert. The information needed to go directly to the source of the connection, not through an administrative layer." She was quiet for a long moment. Through the window behind her I could see the terraces, the inner ones now dense and green and thriving, the yield data I was checking every morning before I walked to the spire, numbers that had, in 3 weeks, reversed a decline that had been progressing for over a year. "Dr. Vasari," she said, "what exactly have you been doing for the past 3 months?" I thought about the breathing floor and the amber-violet light. About 6 hours of sitting on a root network talking to someone whose questions made my own thinking sharper, and then 7 more months of the same, spread across mornings in a room that had acquired a second desk. About a plant on a windowsill that had grown so enthusiastically it was beginning to crowd the window frame. About the 40% I'd kept, and what it had turned into. "My job," I said, "mostly." She looked at me for another moment, then she picked the tablet back up. "You will be reporting to Earth Administration directly from this point forward," she said. "I assume you already knew this." "I assumed it would be the case," I said. "And the liaison posting?" "I've accepted it." She nodded once and looked back at the tablet. The conversation was over. As I stood to leave, she said, without looking up, "The inner terrace yields are up 11% in 3 weeks. 14 actually," I said, "as of this morning." She didn't respond. But as I reached the door, I heard her set the tablet down again, and in the silence that followed I thought I understood something about Garrison Commander Yale Das that I had not understood before. She had spent a long career managing things carefully to prevent them from breaking, and she had done it so consistently that she had forgotten what it looked like when something got better instead. The room and the spire had instruments that made my field kit look like something from a museum exhibit. It also had a second desk. which had arrived without comment 3 weeks after my first visit, and a particular quality of light in the mornings when both suns were at the right angle that I had never encountered anywhere else, and which I was not going to attempt to describe because no description would be adequate. I was there most mornings now. I was working on the restoration proposal, expanded, revised, built on 61 days of data that I now had the instruments to properly analyze. The Queen read everything I wrote. She asked questions that sent me back to the data for another pass, found angles I hadn't seen, suggested connections I hadn't made. She was, I had concluded, the most rigorous scientific mind I had ever worked with. I had also concluded other things, which I was taking somewhat more time to process. One morning I arrived to find a new specimen on my work table, a plant I didn't recognize, not from Terrace 7, not from any of the standard agricultural varieties. Something that grew only near the spire, Sophie told me when I asked, and was not typically found in research settings. It requested to be here, Sophie said with her almost smile. Plants don't request things, I said. On most planets, Sophie said, that is true. I looked at the plant. It was reaching toward the light in the very particular way that healthy plants reach, not desperately, but with confidence, the way living things reach when they are certain the light will be there. I thought about what the Queen had said. The remembering is not subtle. I thought about 61 days of field data and 6 months of morning sessions in a room that had acquired, gradually and without ceremony, a second desk. I thought about what it meant that I had stopped thinking of Velshan as the place I had gone when I ran out of Earth, and had started thinking of it simply as the place where I was. I picked up the plant and moved it to the windowsill where it would get the best of the morning light. Good morning, I told it. The door opened. You are talking to the plant again, the Queen said. It listens better than most people I know, I said. She came to stand beside me at the window. All 4 eyes open, looking at the terraces below, at the dense green of the inner rings that had been pale and struggling when I arrived. The remembering was visible at the surface in the garden beneath the window, tracing patterns in the soil that I had spent weeks trying to decode before I understood that they were not a code so much as a signature. The expansion proposal has been approved, she said. 240 colonists. The first wave arrives in 4 months. I know, I said. I have approximately 4 months to build the framework for integrating that many new people into an ecosystem that is still recovering. It's going to be interesting. You are not worried, she said. I'm worried about 16 specific things, I said. But not about the overall outcome. Because I looked at the plant on the windowsill, which was thriving, which had been thriving since the day I set it here, which had kept growing no matter what. Because the hardest part was finding what was wrong, I said. Once you know what's wrong, you can fix it. That part I'm good at. She was quiet for a moment. The morning light caught the deep ocean of her skin and the 4 open eyes and the quality of her stillness that I had spent 6 months learning to read. Alina, she said. Yes. The 40%, she said, the part you kept. Yes. I would like, she said, for there to be no more percentage, no more 60 and 40, I would like everything. I looked at her. The room was warm, the floor breathed beneath us. The remembering ran bright below the window, and the plant on the sill leaned just slightly toward the place where we were standing. That, I said, will require a different kind of agreement than a scientific liaison posting. I am aware, she said. I'll have to think about the methodology, I said. You will have time, she said. You are staying. It was not a question, but I answered it anyway. Yes, I said. I am. The twin suns climbed the sky outside the window of the spire, and below us the terraces of Velshan ran green and full and alive, and the remembering did what it had always done, carried everything forward, from the center to the edges, from the deep root to the reaching leaf. keeping the record of what was here and what was growing, and what, against all prior expectation, had decided to stay.